Imagine waking up one morning to find the life you built reduced to ashes, not because of an accident, but because someone in power decided they hated you enough to destroy it all. This isn't a random story about bad neighbors or a messy HOA dispute. It's the story of how a single woman, fueled by arrogance and control, crossed every possible line. She wasn't just an HOA president. She was the type of Karen who thrived on power, the type who treated every rule as her personal weapon. I thought she was just another nuisance when she'd find me for leaving my trash can out for 2 hours too long. But what started as petty harassment turned into a nightmare I couldn't have imagined. And the moment I realized the fire that destroyed my home wasn't an accident, I knew this wasn't just HOA drama anymore. This was war. Asterisk, asterisk. When I first moved into the neighborhood, I thought I had finally found peace. It was a quiet cul-de-sac lined with identical houses, manicured lawns, and neighbors who waved politely on their way to work. The kind of suburban dream people imagined when they said they wanted the perfect neighborhood. For the first few weeks, I felt like I had made the right choice. My home was modest, but mine, the mortgage, was manageable, and the idea of a homeowners association gave me a sense of security. Little did I know that very system would be used to destroy me. Asterisk at the center of it all was her, Karen. Not her real name, of course, but the nickname every neighbor used behind closed doors. She was the HOA president, and she ruled with an iron fist, wrapped in passive-aggressive emails. She had lived in the neighborhood for more than a decade, and in her mind, it gave her the right to dictate how everyone else lived. Trash cans must be hidden by 6 p.m. sharp. Lawns trimmed no longer than 2 inches. Driveways cleared of vehicles that weren't luxury sedans. If it wasn't her standard, it wasn't acceptable. Asterisk at first, I brushed it off. Everyone has a difficult neighbor, I thought. The fines she sent for minor infractions felt like a nuisance, not a threat. I paid one when my grass grew slightly too long during a week I was out of town. Another arrived when a delivery truck sat in my driveway too long. It felt unfair, but manageable. I told myself it wasn't worth fighting. I didn't realize then that appeasing her was the worst mistake I could have made. Because once she knew I was willing to comply, she saw me as weak. And Karen thrived on weakness. Asterisk, the first real sign came a month later. I had spent weeks renovating my backyard, putting in a small garden and a fire pit. It was my escape after long workdays, a place to relax. The very night I finished setting it up, I found a letter taped to my door. It was a violation notice. Unauthorized landscaping, it said. Apparently, Karen had decided my backyard garden was unsightly and not in line with the community's values. She demanded I tear it all down within 10 days or face escalating fines. Asterisk, that was the first time I decided to push back. I wrote a firm letter citing the HOA bylaws, which clearly allowed personal gardens as long as they were maintained. I made copies of the rulebook and highlighted the relevant sections, just in case. I thought reason would win out. Instead, it only poured gasoline on the fire. Asterisk, the next week, Karen herself showed up at my door. She didn't knock like a normal person. She banged hard. When I opened it, she stood there with her arms crossed, lips pursed into a thin line. She told me in no uncertain terms that I was not a good fit for the neighborhood. I remember her words clearly because of how chilling they sounded at the time. "People like you don't last long here," she said, then turned on her. Helen walked away. Asterisk. I laughed it off at first, telling myself it was just intimidation. But the very next morning, I found something strange. A crack in my garden fence, like someone had deliberately kicked it. A few of my plants uprooted, their roots exposed to the sun. At the time, I couldn't prove anything, but deep down, I knew who had done it. Karen wasn't just petty. She was vindictive. Asterisk. Weeks went by, and the harassment escalated. More fines, more letters. Even my mail went missing on occasion. I caught glimpses of Karen's smug smile as she drove past my house slowly, as if inspecting it for flaws. Still, I held my ground. I wasn't going to let her win. And then came the night that changed everything. It was just after midnight, when I woke up to the sound of crackling. At first, I thought it was rain against the window. But when I opened my eyes, my bedroom was glowing orange. The smell hit me neck thick, choking smoke filling the air. My heart pounded as I realized the impossible. My house was on fire. Asterisk. I stumbled out of bed, disoriented, coughing, and barely able to see. Flames licked up the hallway walls, moving faster than seemed natural. I grabbed what I could, my phone and a single bag I kept near the door, and ran out into the night. Neighbors were already gathering on the street, some calling the fire department, others staring in shock. But among the crowd, one face stood out. Karen. She stood there, arms crossed, watching my house burn like it was a show made just for her. Asterisk. When the firefighters arrived, it was already too late. The flames consumed everything I had built, every memory, every piece of my life. By dawn, all that remained was a blackened shell of what once was my home. And through the chaos, I kept replaying one thought in my head. This wasn't an accident. Someone had set this fire. Asterisk. And I already had my first suspect. Asterisk. But I had no proof. Not yet. Asterisk. Still, the way she smirked when I caught her eyes across the street told me everything I needed to know. Karen thought she had one. Asterisk. What she didn't realize was that the fire she lit wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning of hers. When the flames died, everyone expected me to collapse under the weight of my loss. My house was gone, my belongings destroyed, and my life reduced to rubble. But shock has a strange way of sharpening focus. As I stood among the charred remains, one truth rang louder than the fire truck still idling in the street. This wasn't nature, and it wasn't fate. It was deliberate. I could almost feel her smug gaze, even when she wasn't there, as if Karen believed she had finally erased me from the neighborhood she ruled. What she didn't expect was that fire doesn't just destroy it, reveals. Burned wood leaves patterns, accelerants leave traces, and lies leave cracks big enough to slip through. As I sifted through the ruins, I realized this story wasn't over. It was just beginning. And my quiet suspicion was about to become a full-blown investigation. Asterisk. The morning after the fire. The neighborhood felt different. Silence lingered, heavy and uncomfortable, broken only by the crunch of boots from firefighters and investigators combing through the wreckage. People avoided my eyes, some offering sympathetic nods, others whispering to each other as if my loss was a spectacle. It wasn't grief that consumed me that morning. It was clarity. I knew what had happened, even if I couldn't yet prove it. Asterisk, the fire marshal approached me as the sun rose higher. His voice was calm but clipped, the tone of someone used to breaking bad news. He told me the cause of the fire was under investigation, but his words carried an unspoken suggestion. Something wasn't right. I caught the way his eyes scanned the debris, lingering on certain areas where the flames had burned hotter, faster, almost unnaturally so. He didn't say it outright, but I could tell he suspected arson. Asterisk, insurance agents arrived soon after, taking pictures, jotting notes, and offering rehearsed condolences. To them, my life was a claim number. To me, it was evidence waiting to be pieced together. I stayed close, listening carefully, noting when they muttered about accelerants or when their cameras zoomed in on patterns along the walls. They thought they were just documenting damage. I knew they were collecting proof. Asterisk, and then there was her, Karen. She appeared on the sidewalk, a coffee cup in hand, her hair perfectly styled as if nothing had happened. She didn't approach me directly, but she lingered long enough to make. Her presence felt, neighbors whispered around her, but none dared confront her. I couldn't prove it yet, but her smirk, the faintest curl of her lips, as she glanced at the ruins, was burned into my memory. Asterisk, I spent that day sifting through what was left, not looking for keepsakes. There were none but for answers. Among the rubble, I found small clues. The fire had started near the side of the house, not inside. The siding was charred in a way that suggested flames had licked upward, not downward. A melted gas can lid lay half buried in the ash. It wasn't proof by itself, but it was something. Asterisk, the fire marshal returned in the afternoon. This time, his questions were sharper. Did I store fuel outside? Did I have enemies? Did I notice anyone lurking around the property that night? I answered honestly, but when I mentioned Karen, her threats, her obsession with rules, the way she had told me I didn't belong, he raised his eyebrows. He didn't dismiss me, but he didn't commit either. He simply nodded and scribbled something into his notebook. Asterisk, the days after the fire were some of the hardest of my life. I stayed in a cheap motel, living out of a bag, with nothing but smoke-stained clothes and a gnawing determination. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Karen's face in the glow of the fire. Every time I heard her car drive past the motel lot, I felt the reminder. She thought she had one. Asterisk, but as investigators dug deeper, cracks began to form in her perfect facade. Neighbors started talking. Whispers spread about Karen's strange behavior the night of the fire. Some claimed they saw her walking near my property earlier than she admitted. Others noticed her sudden insistence on being helpful afterward, suggesting fundraising drives or neighborhood cleanups as if she wanted to control the narrative before anyone questioned her. Asterisk, one neighbor in particular, a quiet man who rarely got involved in HOA drama, approached me privately. He told me he saw Karen carrying something heavy toward my yard the night of the fire. He hadn't spoken up immediately because he feared retaliation. Karen had a history of targeting anyone who opposed her. His words weren't an official statement yet, but they were fuel to the growing suspicion. Asterisk, the turning point came when the fire marshal confirmed accelerant residue had been found. Gasoline spread deliberately. The case was no longer under investigation. It was officially an act of arson. Insurance investigators grew stricter. Law enforcement became involved. And suddenly, Karen's smug confidence seemed less steady. Asterisk, she didn't know I had started documenting everything. Every fine she issued, every threatening letter, every violation notice she left on my door, had kept them all. Even after the fire, I managed to salvage some from my email backups and files. I compiled a timeline: her threats, the vandalism to my garden, the escalation, and finally, the fire. The pieces were coming together like a puzzle. Asterisk still, suspicion wasn't enough. I needed undeniable proof. And proof, I believed, was out there. Asterisk, the police asked for access to security cameras in the neighborhood. And while most homes didn't have them, one crucial detail stood out. The house across the street had a doorbell camera angled just right. It didn't capture the fire itself, but it showed movement near my property in the middle of the night. A figure carrying what looked like a gas can. The image was blurry, but they outlined the shape of the hair. The walk was all too familiar. Asterisk, it wasn't enough to convict, but it was enough to question. Asterisk, when word spread that the police were looking into Karen as a person of interest, the neighborhood's silence cracked wide open. People who had stayed quiet for years suddenly found their voices. Stories poured in. Times she had threatened, moments she had lashed out, little acts of cruelty hidden under the guise of community standards. For the first time, she wasn't untouchable. And then came the twist I didn't expect. Barely a week after the fire, I was summoned to court not for my case, but for a routine HOA dispute hearing I had filed months before regarding her unjust fines. The fire hadn't erased it from the schedule. Asterisk, which meant that after burning down my house, after standing in the street smirking at the ruins, Karen was about to walk straight into a courtroom where I would be waiting. Asterisk, and this time, I wasn't coming empty-handed. Asterisk. The courtroom wasn't supposed to matter. It was a small claims hearing over fines and petty HOA, rules and appointment I'd nearly forgotten about after losing everything. But sometimes fate sets the stage better than any plan could. One week, after watching my house burn, I walked into that courtroom, still smelling faintly of smoke, carrying evidence not of grass heights or mailbox colors, but of something much darker. And then there she was. Karen, perfect hair, polished blazer, carrying herself like she owned not just the neighborhood, but the entire building. She didn't flinch when she saw me. In fact, she smirked. She thought it would be business as usual, her word against mine, her authority versus my silence. What she didn't know was that this time I had more than arguments. I had proof. I had witnesses, and I had the truth on my side. Asterisk, walking into the courthouse felt surreal. My life had been reduced to ashes just days earlier, and yet here I was sitting on a wooden bench in a small, stuffy room where the biggest fights usually involved weeds in a lawn or paint colors that didn't match the community palette. It felt almost insulting. How could something so trivial, be happening when my world had burned down? But I realized quickly this was no longer trivial. This was an opportunity. Karen entered moments later, her heels clicking sharply against the tile, echoing louder than they should have. She carried a folder stuffed with papers, no doubt violation notices and fines she intended to use as weapons. She had ruled so many neighbors in these very hearings that she walked with confidence as though the outcome was predetermined. She didn't even glance at me until she sat down across the aisle. When she finally did, her eyes locked onto mine, and she smirked. That same smirk I'd seen on the night of the fire. The judge entered, and the room quieted. He shuffled through the file, noting the case details. My appeal against unjust fines issued by the HOA. On paper, this was supposed to be a simple dispute, but the atmosphere was different. Even the judge seemed to sense there was more, simmering beneath the surface. Karen went first, speaking with rehearsed authority. She painted me as a problem homeowner, someone who consistently violated community standards and resisted correction. She rattled off minor infractions: trash cans, lawn length, backyard modifications, as though these were crimes worthy of exile. Her tone dripped with condescension, every word aimed not just at the judge, but at me, designed to make me small. When it was my turn, I stood and unfolded a folder I had prepared with trembling hands. My voice was calm, deliberate. I didn't match her theatrics. Instead, I presented documentation, emails, letters, timestamps. I showed the escalation, how her fines and threats had intensified over months, how they went beyond enforcement into harassment. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The paper trail spoke for itself. And then I slid across something new. The fire marshal's preliminary report. Karen's face shifted. Just slightly, but enough to notice. The report wasn't definitive yet, but it stated clearly, evidence suggests presence of accelerant consistent with intentional ignition. I didn't accuse her outright, not yet. Simply let the document sit there, an unspoken reminder that the context of this dispute was no longer just about grass or gardens. The judge leaned back, eyebrows raised. He asked Karen if she had any knowledge of the ongoing investigation. She stammered, caught off guard for the first time. Composure cracked as she insisted it had nothing to do with her. Her voice just a little too defensive. Then came the witnesses. I hadn't expected them to show up, but 2 neighbors had decided to attend after hearing about the hearing. They spoke quietly, but firmly. One recounted how Karen had threatened to make an example of me. Another admitted to seeing her walking near my yard the night of the fire, carrying something heavy. It wasn't sworn testimony for a criminal trial, but it was enough to plant seeds. Enough to tilt the balance. By the time the judge ruled, the outcome of the fines almost didn't matter. He dismissed several of them outright, citing insufficient justification. He reprimanded the HOA for overstepping reasonable authority. But what mattered more was the look on Karen's face. For the first time, she wasn't winning. For the first time, she realized her control was slipping. As the session ended, Karen gathered her papers with shaking hands. She avoided eye contact, her smirk gone. I could see the storm brewing in her eyes a mix of anger, panic, and disbelief. She left the room quickly, her heels no longer sharp, but hurried, uneven. Asterisk, I didn't smile. There was nothing to celebrate. Yet, my house was still gone. My life still in pieces. But this small victory wasn't about fines or bylaws. It was about momentum. For once, the system hadn't bent to her will. And more importantly, she had been forced into a public setting where her power didn't hold absolute sway. Asterisk, outside the courthouse, I breathed the first real sigh of relief in days. Neighbors who had once stayed silent approached me cautiously. Some offered sympathy. Others whispered stories of their own run-ins with Karen. They weren't ready to stand up. Fully not yet, but I could feel the tide turning. She was no longer untouchable. Asterisk, that night, back at the motel, I laid out everything I had gathered. The fire marshal's report, the witness accounts, the timeline of her harassment. Piece by piece, the puzzle was forming. But I also knew Karen. I knew she wouldn't go down quietly. If anything, this public setback would only make her more dangerous. And I was right. Within days, Karen began her counterattack. She flooded the HOA board with new complaints, pushing for emergency meetings. She spread rumors about me, claiming I had staged the fire myself for insurance money. She cornered neighbors, trying to turn them against me, her charm curdling into desperation. The more she fought, the more obvious her cracks became. Asterisk, but she underestimated one thing. Once suspicion takes root, it spreads fast. And now the authorities were paying attention. The blurry doorbell camera footage had been enhanced. And while it wasn't crystal clear, it was enough to suggest someone of Karen's build and stature. Combined with her threats, her history, and the fire marshal's findings, she was no longer just a neighbor. She was a suspect. Asterisk, the walls she had built around herself, walls of control and intimidation, were starting to collapse. Asterisk, and soon. The fire she thought had erased me would ignite something much bigger, her downfall. By now, suspicion had stopped being a whisper. It was a storm gathering speed. The fire marshal's report was no longer a draft. It was official. The word arson wasn't just floating between insurance agents and neighbors. It was stamped on the paperwork in bold letters. And the name Karen wasn't far behind. The same woman who had once fined me for leaving a trash can out overnight was now quietly being investigated for burning an entire home to the ground. But here's the thing about people like Karen. They don't crumble right away. They fight. They claw. They double down on lies so fiercely, they almost believe them themselves. What she didn't realize was that every desperate move she made only pulled her deeper into the hole she dug. The neighborhood wasn't blind anymore, and the police weren't either. The walls were closing in, and Karen could feel it. The days following the court hearing felt different. The balance had shifted. Karen wasn't strutting through the neighborhood anymore, clipboard in hand, dishing out violations like candy. She still tried, of course. Old habits die hard. But the sharpness in her tone had dulled, replaced by a frantic edge, like someone constantly looking over their shoulder. Asterisk, I noticed it first in the way she drove. Before, she would cruise slowly past my property, smugly inspecting every detail. Now, her car rolled faster, eyes darting away when she caught me watching. The queen of the cul-de-sac was rattled, and it showed. Asterisk, the investigation was no longer just paperwork, it was active. Detectives began knocking on doors, asking questions, collecting statements. They spoke to neighbors, one by one, their notebooks filling with the stories people had kept buried for years. Tales of intimidation, threats, and fines that went far beyond reason. One by one, the cracks in Karen's empire spread wider. Asterisk, I remember the day an officer visited me at the motel. He sat across from me at the small wooden table, his notepad resting on the worn surface. He asked about Karen, about the timeline of events leading to the fire. I laid it all out, the threats, the vandalism, the escalation, and finally, the night of the flames. He listened intently, scribbling every detail. When I mentioned the neighbor who saw her carrying something heavy near my property, he nodded slowly. You're not the only one who said that, he told me. That sentence alone sent a chill down my spine. Asterisk Karen, meanwhile, tried her best to spin the narrative. She told anyone who would listen that I had staged the fire for insurance money. She called me a fraud, a manipulator, someone who couldn't handle the HOA's standards. But her words no longer carried weight. Every rumor she spread backfired, making her look more desperate. The power she once wielded with a single email was slipping through her fingers. Asterisk. The investigators didn't stop at witnesses. They combed through financial records, phone logs, and surveillance footage. That blurry doorbell video became a focal point. While it wasn't crystal clear, technology helped sharpen it just enough to show a figure resembling Karen walking near my house, with what looked like a container. The gait, the posture, was eerily familiar. When paired with witness statements, the image painted a picture that was hard to ignore. Asterisk, but the most damning piece of evidence came from her own arrogance. Karen had a habit of documenting everything mails, HOA minutes, even photographs of infractions. She prided herself on her meticulous record-keeping. What she didn't realize was that some of those records would betray her. Investigators found timestamps that placed her near my property hours before the fire, records she couldn't explain away. Her obsession with control left a trail she couldn't erase. Asterisk, the neighborhood itself began to shift. People who once hid behind closed blinds now spoke more freely. Some admitted they had been fined thousands of dollars for ridiculous reasons. One family for leaving a Halloween decoration up a single day too long. Another for having a slightly faded mailbox. Karen's reign had been built on fear, but with the police circling, fear gave way to anger. Neighbors who once stayed silent were now lining up to share their stories. Asterisk, I watched from the sidelines, a strange mix of emotions stirring inside me. On one hand, I felt vindicated. The truth was finally surfacing. But on the other, I felt the weight of what had been lost. No investigation could rebuild the home I had lost. No courtroom could restore the memories burned in the flames. Justice mattered, but it wouldn't erase the scar. Asterisk. Still, I pressed on. I met with investigators whenever asked, handed over every scrap of evidence I had, no matter how small. I knew Karen's playbook: deny, deflect, attack, and I wasn't going to give her any openings. Asterisk, and sure enough, Karen fought back. She hired a lawyer, tried to intimidate witnesses, even filed a counter-complaint against me with the HOA, accusing me of defamation. It was laughable, but it showed her desperation. She wasn't just fighting for power anymore. She was fighting for survival. Asterisk, the turning point came when the police executed a search warrant on her property. Neighbors watched from their windows as officers carried out boxes of evidence. Among the items was a half-empty gas can, tucked away in her garage. Karen claimed it was for her lawnmower, but the investigators weren't convinced. Tests later revealed traces of the same accelerant used in the fire. Asterisk, that was the moment the whispers stopped. Nobody doubted anymore. Karen wasn't just the tyrant HOA president. She was now the prime suspect in an arson investigation. Asterisk, the news spread fast, first through the neighborhood, then through the wider community. Local papers picked up the story. HOA president under investigation for arson. Her perfect image crumbled overnight. The same woman who once bragged about keeping the community up to standard was now a headline for destruction. Asterisk, but even as the evidence piled up, Karen didn't admit guilt. She doubled down, insisting she was framed, that I and a group of disgruntled neighbors had conspired against her. She painted herself as the victim of a witch hunt, clinging to the last shreds of her false authority. Asterisk, it didn't matter anymore. The tide had turned completely. The HOA board, once terrified of crossing her, voted to suspend her presidency pending the outcome of the investigation. Her power was gone. Asterisk, but my fight wasn't over. Because while suspicion and evidence were strong, the law demanded more. The trial loomed ahead, and I knew Karen wasn't finished. She would lie, manipulate, and twist the truth until the very end. Asterisk, and as much as I wanted to see her crumble, I also feared one thing. What if, even after everything, she somehow slipped through the cracks? Courtrooms have a way of stripping people bare. Titles, power, reputation, they all fade when you're standing before a judge with the truth closing in. For Karen, this was the moment her empire of fear collided with reality. The woman who once fined neighbors for cracked driveways was now facing charges of arson, destruction of property, and reckless endangerment. I sat in the gallery, my hands clenched together, watching her take her seat at the defense table. She still carried herself with that same rigid posture, her chin high, but her eyes told a different story. They darted nervously, scanning the room, searching for allies that no longer existed. This wasn't the HOA meeting where she could silence voices with a gavel. This was a courtroom, and the evidence against her was louder than any threat she had ever made. And for the first time, Karen wasn't in control. The trial began on a gray Monday morning. The courthouse buzzed with energy, not just from lawyers and clerks, but from curious neighbors who had followed every step of the investigation. Some sat quietly in the back rows, others whispered among themselves, all waiting to see how the mighty HOA president would fare when the spotlight wasn't hers to control. Asterisk, Karen walked in wearing a navy suit, her hair perfectly styled, her lips pursed in that familiar way. She wanted to look unshaken, as though this was just another community dispute she would win with ease. But beneath the polish, her movements betrayed her. Her hands fidgeted, tugging at her sleeves. Her lawyer leaned in close, whispering, but Karen's eyes kept flicking toward me in the gallery, as if trying to measure whether I was afraid. I wasn't. Not anymore. Asterisk, the prosecution opened with fire. They painted the picture vividly. A long history of harassment, escalating conflicts, and finally, the night of the blaze. They presented the fire marshal's report first, letting the expert walk the jury through the details: burn patterns, accelerant traces, the unmistakable signs of deliberate ignition. Charts and photographs flashed on the screen, each one nail in the coffin of accident. Asterisk, Karen's lawyer objected, tried to poke holes, but the evidence was relentless. The gas can found in her garage, the residues matching the fire, the blurry doorbell footage enhanced enough to show a figure eerily similar to her. Frame it, all built a story too strong to ignore. Asterisk, then came the neighbors. One by one, they took the stand. Some spoke with hesitation, others with relief, but their words stacked like bricks against her. They recounted the threats, the petty fines, the harassment that had stretched for years. One described seeing her near my property the night of the fire, carrying something heavy. Another admitted she had once bragged about getting rid of problems in the neighborhood. Alone, each testimony might have been dismissed as bias. Together, they formed a chorus that was impossible to silence. Asterisk, when it was my turn, the courtroom grew still. I walked to the stand, the weight of everything pressing on me. My voice shook at first, but steadied as I spoke. I told my story, from the moment I moved into the neighborhood to the night I fled my burning home. I described the harassment, the escalation, the way Karen's smirk haunted me as the flames consumed my life. I didn't embellish. I didn't need to. The truth was powerful enough. Asterisk, as I finished, I glanced toward Karen. She wasn't smirking anymore. Her jaw was tight, her face pale. For once, she couldn't interrupt, couldn't intimidate, couldn't twist the narrative. She just had to sit there and listen. Asterisk, the defense tried to counter. They painted me as disgruntled, suggested I had enemies. Outside the neighborhood, even floated the idea that I had staged the fire myself. But without evidence, their arguments fell flat. Every attempt to deflect only highlighted the absence of proof on their side. Asterisk, Karen herself took the stand. And that was the moment her mask finally cracked. She tried to project confidence, but under cross-examination, her answers faltered. When asked about the gas can in her garage, she insisted it was for her lawnmower, yet couldn't explain why traces of the exact accelerant used in the fire matched it. When confronted about the doorbell footage, she claimed it wasn't her. But her vague denials sounded hollow, and when pressed on her threats against me, her voice wavered. The jury could see it. Everyone could. Asterisk, the prosecution ended their case with a devastating sequence. A slideshow of my home before and after. Pictures of my small garden, my fire pit, the place I had worked so hard to build. Then the charred remains, blackened wood, an ash where memories once lived. The contrast was brutal. And as those images filled the courtroom, I watched the jury's faces harden. This wasn't just about rules or fines. This was about destruction, about cruelty. Asterisk, by the end of the day, Karen's aura of control was gone. She sat slumped in her chair, whispering furiously to her lawyer, her confidence drained. The woman who once commanded an entire neighborhood with fear was now just another defendant. Cornered by her own actions, asterisk, as the trial stretched on, the weight of evidence only grew. The prosecution connected dots Karen thought she had hidden, laying out a timeline that was impossible to dismiss. Her arrogance had left trails, emails, notes, even comments in HOA meetings that now read like confessions. Asterisk, the defense tried to stretch doubt, but the more they spoke, the thinner their case became. And through it all, I sat in the gallery, silent but steady, knowing that the truth was finally louder than her lies. Asterisk, when closing arguments wrapped, the courtroom fell quiet. The jury would deliberate soon. Karen's eyes darted nervously around the room, no longer searching for allies, but for an escape. There was none. Asterisk, I left that day with a strange mix of exhaustion and resolve. I didn't know what the verdict would be yet, but I knew this. No matter the outcome, Karen's reign of intimidation was over. She couldn't silence me. She couldn't silence the truth. And tomorrow, the jury would decide her fate. The waiting was the hardest part. Hours stretched into what felt like days as the jury deliberated. Each tick of the clock echoed like a drumbeat, marking the distance between everything Karen had taken from me and the justice I prayed was coming. I knew the evidence was strong. I knew the neighbors had finally spoken, but doubt still crept in. What if she slipped through? What if all her lies and manipulation bought her one last escape? The thought chilled me, because people like Karen don't just ruin homes, they ruin lives. And then, at last, the doors opened. The jury filed in, faces stern, eyes unwavering. The room went silent as the foreman stood and read the verdict. This was the moment Karen's empire of intimidation, threats, and fire would either collapse or rise again. And I was about to learn if justice really existed. Asterisk. When the jury returned, the entire courtroom went still. Even the air seemed to hold its breath. Karen sat at the defense table, her hands clasped so tightly, her knuckles whitened. Her lawyer leaned in, whispering last-minute reassurances, but it was clear neither of them believed the words. For once, her smirk was gone. All that remained was the mask of someone realizing their control had finally run out. Asterisk, the foreman stood. The judge asked the question. Asterisk, on the charge of arson, how do you find the defendant? Asterisk, guilty. Asterisk, a collective gasp rippled through the room. Some neighbors clasped their mouths. Others exchanged glances, their fear finally replaced with vindication. Karen flinched, but held herself rigid, as if refusing to show weakness even now. Asterisk, the charges continued. Destruction of property, guilty. Reckless endangerment, guilty. One by one, the words landed like hammers driving nails into the coffin. Of her reign, asterisk, I sat motionless, my heart pounding. Part of me wanted to cry, part of me wanted to cheer, but what I felt most of all was release. After months of harassment, after losing everything in the flames, after sleepless nights replaying the smirk on her face as my house burned, justice had spoken. Asterisk, Karen's lawyer tried to request leniency, painting her as a passionate community leader who lost her way. But the judge wasn't swayed. He spoke with measured weight, describing her actions as a gross abuse of authority and a betrayal of the very community she claimed to protect. When he pronounced her sentences behind bars, fines, and a permanent ban from serving on any HOA, the courtroom buzzed with murmurs of relief. Asterisk, Karen didn't cry. She didn't apologize. She sat there, staring ahead, jaw tight, as though still clinging to some fantasy where she was the victim. But in that moment, everyone knew the truth. The queen of the cul-de-sac had fallen, and there was no rebuilding what she had destroyed. Asterisk, when it was over, I walked out of the courthouse into the sunlight. For the first time since the fire, I felt the weight lift. My home was gone, yes, but the shadow Karen had cast over my life and over the lives of my neighbors was gone too. People stopped me outside, thanking me for standing up, for refusing to stay silent. They admitted they had been too afraid before, but seeing Karen held accountable gave them courage. Asterisk, in the weeks that followed, the neighborhood changed. The HOA, stripped of Karen's control, elected new leadership. Rules were still enforced, but with fairness, not malice. Neighbors who once avoided each other out of fear of fines began talking again, building the kind of community we were supposed to have from the beginning. Asterisk, as for me, I started rebuilding. Insurance covered part of it. Donations from neighbors covered more. But what mattered most was the sense of belonging I felt for the first time. The garden would bloom again, the fire pit would return, and though the scars of that night would never fully fade, they were no longer wounds. They were proof that I had survived. Asterisk and Karen. She faded from relevance. Her name became a cautionary tale whispered in the neighborhood, a reminder of what happens when control turns into cruelty. She didn't just lose her position, she lost the very thing she craved most: power. Asterisk, but if there's one lesson I carry from all of this, it's that standing up matters. Bullies thrive on silence. Karen thought she could scare me, isolate me, even erase me. Instead, her fire lit something stronger: resistance, truth, and the courage of a community that had been silent too long. Asterisk, in the end, her downfall wasn't just about me. It was about everyone who had suffered under her rule. And as the final gavel struck that day, I realized something I'll never forget. Sometimes justice doesn't just punish, it frees. So what do you think? Did Karen deserve the punishment she got? Or do you think the judge should have gone even further? Have you ever had an HOA president or a neighbor who pushed things way too far? Drop your stories in the comments below, because I know I'm not the only one who's faced a Karen like this. And if you want more unbelievable HOA and neighbor revenge stories, make sure to subscribe, because this was just one of many. Asterisk.